The search for lost tombs has often led through ruins, deserts, and broken cities, uncovering fragments of power but rarely the truth behind them. Across decades of expeditions, traces of rulers have surfaced only in pieces, inscriptions without bodies, chambers without names. Yet among all of them, one figure remains more elusive than the rest: Gilgamesh, a king recorded in stone and story, but never definitively placed in death, his supposed resting place lingering somewhere between history and uncertainty. Step into the shifting terrain where ancient rivers once carved through dense, overgrown land, where satellite images, buried structures, and abandoned dig sites hint at something hidden beneath layers of earth and silence. Here, each discovery leads deeper into unanswered questions through excavation zones, submerged ground, and fragments of text, until what was found begins to feel less like a conclusion and more like the beginning of something still unresolved: the lost tomb of Alexander the Great. Across centuries of historical inquiry, few figures have drawn as much sustained attention as Alexander the Great, whose death in 323 BCE in Babylon marked not only the collapse of an unprecedented empire but also the beginning of one of antiquity's most persistent mysteries: the location of his burial. What began as a recorded death under the rule of the Macedonian court quickly transformed into a sequence of contested movements, fragmented reports, and competing claims that would follow his remains across regions and generations. The expeditionary searches that later emerged, both in ancient documentation and modern archaeological investigation, continue to circle the same unresolved question: what ultimately happened to the body of the man who reshaped the known world? Ancient sources provide the earliest framework for the mystery, though even these accounts resist consistency. Writers such as Diodorus Siculus, Curtius Rufus, and Strabo describe how Alexander's body, after he died in Babylon, was preserved under royal instruction and prepared for transport back to Macedonia. However, the journey itself becomes uncertain almost immediately, with narratives suggesting that the funeral procession was intercepted or redirected under the influence of rival successors who recognized the political weight of controlling his remains. Some traditions place the body in Memphis, Egypt, while others describe its eventual relocation to Alexandria, where the Ptolemaic dynasty is believed to have enshrined it within a royal district reserved for Macedonian rulers. What complicates these accounts is not only their variation, but the fact that they were written across different centuries, often reflecting the political realities of their own time rather than direct eyewitness testimony. By the Roman era, references to Alexander's tomb in Alexandria suggest that it had become a recognized site of reverence, reportedly visited by figures such as Julius Caesar and Augustus. Yet even these accounts introduce ambiguity, as later writers imply that the precise location was already becoming uncertain, with descriptions shifting between a visible monument and a more symbolic or ceremonial resting place, whose physical trace was fading from public knowledge. Modern archaeological interest in the tomb of Alexander has concentrated heavily on Alexandria, a city whose continuous occupation has both preserved and obscured its ancient layers. Beneath the modern urban landscape lies a complex network of Hellenistic and Roman-era structures, many of which have been uncovered through excavation projects conducted over the last century. Areas such as Com el Dika, the ancient royal quarters, and submerged sections of the eastern harbour have revealed temples, burial complexes, and administrative buildings that confirm the city's importance during the Ptolemaic period. Yet despite these discoveries, no site has produced definitive evidence that can be directly linked to Alexander's burial. Repeated excavation efforts have been further complicated by the transformation of Alexandria over time. Earthquakes, coastal shifts, and successive rebuilding phases have altered the ancient city's layout, while modern construction has limited access to some of the most historically promising areas. Even when archaeological layers suggest the presence of elite burials or royal structures, the absence of inscriptions or identifiable markers leaves the connection to Alexander purely speculative. This has led many researchers to approach the subject cautiously, treating each potential discovery as part of a broader cultural landscape rather than direct evidence of the Macedonian king's tomb. One of the most persistent challenges in the investigation is the weight of contradictory historical traditions that place the tomb in multiple possible locations across different eras. Some accounts suggest that Alexander's body remained in Alexandria for centuries, displayed in a glass or gold sarcophagus within a royal mausoleum known as the Sema or Soma, a site reportedly located in the heart of the city's royal district. Other traditions, however, propose that the tomb may have been relocated, damaged, or even lost during periods of political upheaval, particularly during the late Roman or early Byzantine transitions when many pagan monuments were repurposed or destroyed. These conflicting narratives create a historical tension that has shaped every modern attempt to locate the tomb. Archaeologists must navigate not only the physical landscape of ancient Alexandria, but also the layered interpretations of historians who documented the site long after its supposed existence. As a result, each expedition tends to generate partial insights, fragments of structures, indirect references, or architectural alignments that hint at royal activity without confirming identity. Even underwater surveys of Alexandria's ancient coastline, which have revealed submerged ruins of palatial complexes, have not resolved the central question, as no artifact has been recovered that definitively connects to Alexander himself. What emerges from this ongoing investigation is less a single missing tomb and more a pattern of historical erosion, where documentation, memory, and material evidence gradually diverge. The figure of Alexander the Great becomes increasingly difficult to anchor in physical space, not because of a lack of interest or effort, but because each generation inherits a version of the story already shaped by uncertainty. Ancient authors preserved fragments, later historians interpreted them through political and cultural lenses, and modern archaeology continues to test those interpretations against a landscape that has changed dramatically over 2 millennia. Even within scholarly discourse, there is no consensus on whether Alexander's tomb still exists in a recoverable form, or whether it has been destroyed, relocated, or absorbed into structures that no longer resemble their original state. This ambiguity has not diminished interest in the search. Instead, it has sustained it, turning the tomb into a focal point for discussions about historical memory, imperial legacy, and the limits of archaeological certainty. Each expedition, whether terrestrial or underwater, adds another layer to a case that resists closure, reinforcing the idea that some of antiquity's most important figures may exist more firmly in narrative tradition than in recoverable space. As the investigation continues, the absence of definitive evidence becomes its own form of historical presence, shaping how Alexander is understood not only as a conqueror, but as a figure whose physical legacy has dissolved into the complexities of time, politics, and interpretation. A ruler whose final resting place remains unclaimed by history, and whose absence continues to raise the question of whether it was ever truly lost or simply hidden too well to be found. The search for Cleopatra's tomb. Beneath the long shadow of the late Ptolemaic period, Cleopatra VII's final days alongside Mark Antony in 30 BCE set in motion a disappearance that has never been fully accounted for in surviving records. Her death marked not only the end of native Egyptian rule, but also the beginning of a historical uncertainty that would outlast the empire itself, as ancient sources preserved fragments of events without clearly documenting what became of her burial. Within the framework of Roman-era accounts, the absence of a precise and consistently described tomb location becomes more striking than the political drama that surrounded her final moments, leaving modern historians with a narrative defined as much by what is missing as by what is recorded. Within the fragmented accounts left by Roman-era writers, the burial of Cleopatra is referenced only indirectly, often tied to broader descriptions of the aftermath of the civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Writers such as Plutarch describe her death occurring in Alexandria under guarded circumstances, yet they provide limited detail regarding the handling of her body, beyond the implication of a royal burial consistent with her status. Over time, these accounts diverge, with later interpretations suggesting she may have been interred alongside Antony, while others remain silent on any confirmed resting place, allowing uncertainty to take root early in the historical record itself. Even within Roman political narratives, emphasis is placed more on the end of her dynasty than on the preservation of her physical legacy, which may explain why no single authoritative burial account survived intact. West of modern Alexandria, the archaeological site known as Taposiris Magna gradually emerged in recent decades as one of the most examined locations in the search for a possible royal burial, drawing sustained attention from excavation teams due to its historical and religious significance during the Ptolemaic period. The site, originally associated with a temple dedicated to Osiris, presents a complex archaeological landscape where Greco-Egyptian cultural layers intersect, creating conditions that could plausibly align with elite burials from the late dynastic era. Its proximity to Alexandria, combined with its ritual importance, has made it a focal point for hypotheses regarding concealed royal interments. The alignment of religious symbolism with funerary practices in this region has further strengthened its relevance in ongoing investigations. Through successive excavation seasons at Taposiris Magna, underground structures and burial shafts have been uncovered that suggest sustained ritual or funerary activity during the Ptolemaic period. These findings include architectural corridors, sealed chambers, and spatial arrangements that indicate deliberate construction rather than incidental use. Yet none have produced inscriptions or markers that definitively identify Cleopatra or any immediate members of the royal household. In some cases, the construction techniques observed at the site resemble other high-status Ptolemaic burial environments, though the absence of naming inscriptions prevents direct attribution. The ambiguity created by this gap has made each discovery simultaneously promising and inconclusive. Among the materials recovered at the site, small but contextually significant artifacts such as coins, pottery fragments, and inscriptions have been carefully analysed for chronological alignment with Cleopatra's reign. Some of these objects bear imagery associated with the late Ptolemaic period, including depictions linked to royal symbolism and deities associated with death and rebirth, offering temporal reinforcement that the site was active during her lifetime. Additional findings include fragments of funerary objects consistent with elite burial practices in Hellenistic Egypt, though their distribution across multiple layers suggests long-term usage rather than a single identifiable burial event tied to Cleopatra herself. Across the shifting coastline of ancient Alexandria, geological and environmental changes over centuries have steadily altered or submerged areas that once held critical political and ceremonial importance. Earthquakes recorded in antiquity, combined with gradual coastal subsidence, have reshaped the ancient urban landscape in ways that complicate any attempt to reconstruct precise burial locations. Historical accounts suggest that parts of the royal quarter may now lie beneath the modern Mediterranean coastline, meaning that any structure associated with Cleopatra's burial could theoretically exist underwater or beneath unstable sediment layers that remain difficult to access. Between competing historical interpretations, Cleopatra's burial is alternatively placed within Alexandria's royal districts or within more secluded sanctuaries outside the city's core, reflecting the uncertainty embedded in surviving ancient narratives. Some interpretations suggest a formal interment within a dynastic mausoleum associated with the royal lineage, possibly near the royal palace complex, while others propose a more concealed arrangement shaped by the political instability that followed the collapse of her reign. The lack of consensus among historians highlights not only gaps in the record, but also the influence of later Roman interpretations, which often reframed Ptolemaic history through the lens of imperial transition rather than local tradition. As excavation work continues at Taposiris Magna, the balance between cautious academic interpretation and public speculation has become increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly as intermittent discoveries are interpreted through widely varying theoretical frameworks. Archaeological teams have emphasized the importance of stratigraphic analysis and contextual verification, noting that many promising findings require extensive validation before any historical conclusions can be drawn. This careful approach stands in contrast to external speculation, where isolated discoveries are sometimes interpreted as definitive evidence, despite lacking corroboration from broader excavation data. Following the collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the gradual Roman restructuring of Egypt contributed to the erosion of many localized burial traditions and administrative records, further obscuring the historical trace of elite interments. Administrative systems were replaced, cultural priorities shifted, and earlier dynastic markers were often repurposed or neglected, creating a discontinuity in the archaeological record. In addition, the symbolic dismantling of Cleopatra's political legacy in Roman narratives may have further reduced the preservation of precise burial documentation, leaving only fragmented references that survive through secondary transmission rather than official archival continuity. Despite extensive exploration efforts and multiple investigative phases, no definitive material evidence has yet been recovered that can be directly linked to Cleopatra's burial site, leaving the central question unresolved within both academic and archaeological communities. Each excavation season adds new data, Yet the absence of a conclusive identifier continues to define the search, shaping it as an ongoing investigation rather than a completed discovery. The site remains active, but its connection to Cleopatra exists only within the boundaries of possibility rather than confirmation, where every uncovered structure adds detail without resolving the core mystery. A queen whose story ends where the evidence disappears into the ground that still refuses to give anything back. The forbidden burial of Genghis Khan. Centuries after the expansion of the Mongol Empire reached its peak under Genghis Khan, historical records surrounding his death in 1227 remain unusually restrained, with even basic details of his final burial left deliberately unclear across surviving accounts. Unlike many rulers of comparable influence, whose deaths were documented with ceremonial precision or political record-keeping, the end of Genghis Khan's life is described in a way that feels fragmented, as if the historical narrative itself avoids settling on a single version of events. Within early sources, including later compiled histories such as The Secret History of the Mongols, the focus often shifts quickly from his death to the continuation of the empire, leaving the circumstances of his burial suspended in deliberate ambiguity. Even the transmission of these accounts through later centuries appears cautious, as though preserving the uncertainty was more important than resolving it. Across the cultural framework of Mongol society during the early 13th century, burial practices for high-ranking leaders were shaped by traditions that prioritized secrecy and the prevention of physical memorialization, unlike sedentary civilizations that constructed monumental tombs to preserve political legacy. Mongol elite burials are widely understood to have emphasized concealment within the natural landscape, reflecting a worldview in which permanence was not tied to architecture but to memory and lineage. Historical descriptions suggest that burial sites were intended to leave no visible marker, ensuring that the resting place could not be easily identified or disturbed in later generations, a practice that would later become central to the enduring mystery surrounding Genghis Khan himself. In this context, absence was not accidental, but intentional, embedded within cultural logic rather than imposed by time. Historical sources describing the final military campaign of Genghis Khan place his death within a broader period of Mongol expansion, yet they differ significantly when identifying the precise geographic location of his passing. Some accounts situate his final moments during campaigns in the region associated with Western Xia territory, while others place emphasis on movements across northern China and the Mongolian steppe, reflecting the mobile nature of his military presence and the lack of fixed administrative centres during his rule. This geographical uncertainty is not a minor inconsistency, but a structural limitation of the historical record itself, where rapid military movement and limited written documentation create overlapping but non-identical versions of the same events. Within several later historical traditions, accounts emerge suggesting that immediate post-death procedures involved extraordinary measures to prevent any external knowledge of the burial site from being preserved. These narratives, preserved in varying forms across Mongol and later historical writings, describe a highly controlled process in which the movement of the body was conducted under strict secrecy, with strict limitations placed on those who participated in or witnessed the proceedings. Some versions even imply that knowledge of the route or location was restricted to a minimal number of individuals, reinforcing the idea that concealment was not a secondary effect, but a central objective of the burial process itself. Among the oral and written traditions that developed over subsequent generations, recurring narratives describe elaborate concealment methods that were intended to erase any visible trace of the burial process. Some accounts refer to the alteration of natural landscapes, while others describe symbolic or ritual actions designed to disrupt spatial memory, such as the removal of identifying landmarks or the intentional disruption of environmental continuity. Although these stories vary in detail and origin, they consistently reinforce a shared theme, that the burial was structured in a way that actively resisted rediscovery, embedding secrecy into both practice and landscape. Under the administrative structure of the Mongol Empire, record-keeping practices differed significantly from those of contemporary sedentary civilizations, relying heavily on oral transmission and controlled documentation that prioritized political stability over historical preservation. This system, while highly effective for governing a vast and rapidly expanding empire, left limited permanent records of events considered sensitive or strategically significant. As a result, the historical documentation surrounding the death and burial of Genghis Khan exists primarily through later compilations and external accounts, each shaped by the political and cultural context in which they were written, rather than direct contemporary recording. The absence of centralized archival continuity further deepens the uncertainty, as even secondary references often avoid specific geographic precision. During early exploratory periods in later centuries, historians and travelers attempting to identify the burial location encountered widespread geographical uncertainty across the Mongolian steppe, a landscape that itself resists fixed interpretation due to its vastness and seasonal transformation. The nomadic structure of the region meant that place names, routes, and boundaries were fluid rather than static, complicating any attempt to align historical references with physical geography. Even when local traditions pointed toward possible sacred or restricted areas, these indications remained broad and symbolic rather than precise, reflecting cultural memory that preserved significance without preserving coordinates. In modern times, technological approaches such as satellite imaging and remote sensing have been applied to vast regions traditionally associated with Mongol imperial activity, yet no definitive site has been confirmed. Archaeological surveys conducted across Mongolia have identified burial complexes, ritual landscapes, and steppe settlements from various historical periods, but none have produced evidence that can be conclusively linked to Genghis Khan. The scale of the search has expanded alongside technological capability, incorporating increasingly detailed terrain analysis, yet the results remain consistent in their inability to isolate a single, verifiable location. From an archaeological perspective, the absence of physical remains linked to Genghis Khan's burial is often understood as a consequence of both environmental conditions and cultural practices that resisted monument construction. The nomadic lifestyle of the Mongols, combined with burial customs that emphasized concealment, created conditions in which physical traces were intentionally minimized from the moment of interment. Over time, natural erosion, sediment shifts, and ecological change across the steppe further reduced the likelihood that any subtle markers could survive in a recognizable form, reinforcing the difficulty of locating a definitive site even under modern investigative conditions. As each investigative effort expands across wider territories without producing conclusive results, the gap between historical narrative and physical evidence continues to remain unresolved. The search does not converge toward a single point of failure or discovery, but instead disperses across interpretations, landscapes, and traditions that resist unification into one identifiable location. In this sense, the mystery is sustained not by lack of effort, but by the structural absence embedded within its own historical foundation, where even the concept of a site becomes increasingly difficult to define. Somewhere across the vast silence of the steppe, the truth of his resting place continues to exist only in what was carefully never left behind: the missing tomb of Nefertiti. Nefertiti's name appears in Egyptian history with unusual clarity during the height of the Amarna period, yet it fades almost completely from surviving records shortly after the political and religious changes that followed. Unlike many royal figures of the 18th dynasty, whose burials can be traced through inscriptions or later references, her presence seems to narrow into a historical silence that begins while her husband Akhenaten's reforms were still reshaping the religious structure of Egypt. The disappearance is not marked by a single recorded event, but by the gradual absence of documentation, where references that once placed her prominently in royal life stop short of describing what came after, as though the historical record itself loses the ability to continue her narrative beyond a certain point. Royal inscriptions from the late 18th dynasty reveal a pattern of revision and omission that has led historians to question how much of the Amarna record was intentionally altered. The shift away from Aten-centered worship after Akhenaten's reign involved a broader restoration of traditional religious authority, and in that process, many figures associated with the Amarna period were either reinterpreted or removed from official memory. This restructuring did not occur all at once, but across successive reigns, where names, cartouches, and references were gradually modified or replaced, leaving gaps that are difficult to interpret as either political erasure or administrative correction. In this environment, the absence of Nefertiti becomes part of a wider pattern of controlled historical rewriting, rather than an isolated disappearance. The restoration of traditional religious authority in ancient Egypt introduced a period where many figures associated with Akhenaten's reign were either reinterpreted or left without formal historical placement. This transition was not only theological, but administrative, affecting how royal lineage and burial practices were recorded and preserved across multiple reigns that followed. In official context, emphasis shifted back toward Amun-centered traditions, and the Amarna period itself became increasingly distanced from state-sanctioned historical continuity. Within this framework, the lack of a clearly documented burial for Nefertiti does not stand alone, but exists alongside other omissions that collectively reshape how that era is understood in later Egyptian history. Among modern archaeological hypotheses, one of the most closely examined ideas suggests that elements of Nefertiti's burial may be concealed within or adjacent to the structure of Tutankhamun's tomb. This theory emerged from observations of structural irregularities and spatial inconsistencies within KV62, which differ in subtle but notable ways from other royal tombs of the same period. Rather than proposing a separate undiscovered burial site in isolation, this hypothesis focuses on the possibility that her resting place may have been integrated into an already known archaeological structure, hidden behind architectural modifications that were either intentional during construction or introduced during later use of the tomb complex. The layout of KV62 has long stood out among royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings due to its unusually compact design and structural irregularities compared to other 18th dynasty burials. While it is confirmed as the tomb of Tutankhamun, its internal configuration has prompted extensive study because certain sections appear architecturally atypical for a royal burial of his status. These observations include abrupt spatial transitions and sealed areas that do not fully align with standard tomb construction patterns of the period. Some researchers have suggested that these anomalies may indicate the presence of earlier structural planning or unused extensions, although no excavation has confirmed additional chambers beyond those already documented. Non-invasive scanning projects conducted in the Valley of the Kings have produced subsurface readings that continue to be analysed for indications of hidden architectural voids. These technologies, including ground-penetrating radar and other imaging systems, have allowed researchers to examine areas behind sealed walls without physical excavation, revealing variations in density and structural composition that require further interpretation. In some cases, reported anomalies have generated renewed interest in specific sections of KV62, though subsequent analysis has not produced conclusive evidence of additional burial spaces. The data itself remains open to interpretation, shaped by the limitations of scanning resolution and the complexity of ancient stone structures. Interpretations of these subsurface anomalies remain divided, with some analyses attributing them to natural geological formations and others considering the possibility of artificial construction. The geological complexity of the Valley of the Kings, shaped by centuries of erosion, tectonic activity, and sediment compression, makes it difficult to distinguish between naturally occurring voids and intentionally modified spaces. Even subtle differences in material density can produce readings that appear structurally significant without corresponding to actual architectural features. As a result, each new dataset contributes to the discussion without resolving it, reinforcing the idea that technological advancement expands perception but does not necessarily clarify meaning. Ancient Egyptian burial practices frequently involved modifications, reuse, or concealment of tomb structures, particularly during periods of political transition and dynastic change. Royal necropolises were dynamic environments where tombs could be expanded, repurposed, or sealed depending on shifting religious and administrative priorities. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites confirms that later rulers sometimes reused earlier burial spaces or incorporated existing structures into new funerary arrangements. This historical context provides a framework in which the possibility of concealed or integrated burial chambers cannot be dismissed outright, even though direct evidence linking such practices specifically to Nefertiti has not been established. The absence of any confirmed burial attribution for Nefertiti persists despite extensive archaeological mapping of royal necropolises associated with the New Kingdom, including detailed surveys of the Valley of the Kings and surrounding desert regions. Excavations have documented numerous royal and elite tombs, many of which contain inscriptions, burial goods, and architectural markers that allow for clear identification. Yet Nefertiti remains absent from this record in a way that is unusual given her status during the Amarna period, leaving her final resting place one of the few unresolved questions in a period otherwise well documented through material remains. Even with continuous advancements in imaging and excavation methodology, no identifiable artifact or inscription has yet resolved the question of her final resting place. Each investigative phase refines the understanding of the valley's structure and increases the resolution of subsurface mapping, yet the specific connection to Nefertiti remains unestablished. The result is a situation where increasing precision in archaeological technique does not translate into historical clarity, and where improved visibility does not necessarily reveal answers that can be confirmed with certainty. What remains is not a disappearance in the usual sense, but a trace that never fully settles into what has been uncovered, this sealed tomb of Qin Shi Huang. Unification of ancient China under Qin Shi Huang established one of the most ambitious imperial burial projects in recorded history, centered on a vast underground complex near present-day Xi'an that remains only partially explored. The expeditionary attention surrounding this site intensified after the discovery of the Terracotta Army, which revealed that the emperor's burial environment was not a single chamber, but an extensive constructed landscape designed to mirror imperial authority in physical form. Despite this discovery, the central burial mound has remained untouched, preserving a boundary between what has been uncovered and what is still intentionally left beyond reach. Construction records and historical accounts from early imperial China describe a burial system designed on a scale that reflected absolute centralized power and unprecedented labor organization. Ancient sources attribute decades of work to the creation of the mausoleum complex, involving vast mobilization of resources, artisans and labor forces under strict imperial control. The design is consistently described as symbolic, intended to replicate the structure of the empire itself within an underground environment, where political order was transformed into spatial arrangement. Even in these early records, emphasis is placed not only on scale, but on protection and containment. In 1974, agricultural work near Lintong led to the accidental discovery of terracotta figures that revealed the outer defensive layer of a much larger imperial burial structure. What initially appeared to be isolated artifacts soon expanded into one of the most significant archaeological findings of the 20th century, as excavation uncovered entire pits containing thousands of life-sized figures arranged in military formation. These figures are widely understood to represent a funerary army designed to accompany or protect the emperor in the afterlife, confirming that the burial complex extends far beyond the central mound visible at the surface. Beneath the central burial mound attributed to Qin Shi Huang, geophysical surveys have indicated complex subsurface formations that suggest multiple internal layers yet to be accessed. These readings have identified variations in density and structural composition beneath the mound, but they have not provided definitive confirmation of openable chambers or accessible corridors. The data has instead reinforced the understanding that the interior is architecturally complex, with structural arrangements that remain beyond direct archaeological reach due to preservation restrictions. Ancient historical texts, particularly those compiled during the Han Dynasty, contain descriptions of elaborate protective mechanisms said to guard the emperor's burial chamber. These accounts present the tomb as an engineered environment designed to deter intrusion, combining symbolic representations of imperial geography with mechanical or structural deterrents. While these descriptions were recorded after Qin Shi Huang's reign, they have persisted as part of the historical narrative surrounding the mausoleum, shaping how later generations understood the intended security of the burial site. Among the most frequently cited accounts from early historiography are references to constructed waterways and environmental hazards allegedly integrated into the tomb's internal design. One of the most enduring descriptions comes from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, which refers to simulated rivers and seas of mercury within the burial complex. These accounts are not independently verified through direct excavation, but they remain influential in shaping both scholarly and public interpretations of the tomb's interior design and symbolic intent. Modern scientific assessments have detected elevated levels of mercury in soil samples surrounding the burial mound, aligning with long-standing historical descriptions recorded in ancient texts. While these findings do not confirm the exact structure described in historical sources, they have contributed to ongoing discussions about the accuracy of early accounts. The presence of mercury anomalies in the surrounding environment has been interpreted cautiously, with researchers noting that contamination or natural geological factors may also play a role, leaving the question open to interpretation. Despite extensive archaeological interest, the central chamber of the mausoleum remains unopened due to preservation concerns and the potential risk of irreversible structural damage. Chinese archaeological authorities have maintained a policy of non-invasive study for the core burial area, prioritizing long-term preservation over direct excavation. This decision reflects both the cultural significance of the site and the uncertainty surrounding the conditions within the tomb, where exposure to air and environmental change could compromise any artifacts or structures still preserved inside. Advancements in non-invasive imaging technologies have allowed researchers to map sections of the burial complex without breaching its internal structure. Techniques such as ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing have provided increasingly detailed representations of subsurface features, revealing complex layering beneath the mound. However, these methods remain limited in their ability to distinguish fine structural detail at deeper levels, meaning that interpretations of internal space are still based on indirect evidence rather than direct observation. The decision to maintain the tomb's sealed condition reflects a broader balance between archaeological inquiry and long-term preservation of cultural heritage. Unlike many ancient sites that have been fully excavated, the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang represents a case where knowledge of the site is extensive, yet physical access remains deliberately restricted. This creates a unique archaeological situation in which the subject of study is both fully acknowledged and simultaneously inaccessible, existing within a boundary defined by caution rather than absence. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang is fully known, yet its deepest chamber has never been entered: the lost Amber Room chamber. Unlike tombs that vanish over centuries, the Amber Room existed in full view before it was systematically dismantled and removed during the final stages of stability in pre-war Europe. Its disappearance is not rooted in ancient ambiguity, but in a sequence of modern, documented actions that abruptly lose clarity at a critical point. The expeditions that later followed were not attempts to locate something forgotten, but efforts to retrace a movement that had once been recorded with precision, only to dissolve into uncertainty during the final years of World War II. This distinction gives the search a different character, where the challenge lies not in uncovering the past, but in identifying where the record itself stopped being reliable. Originally constructed in the early 18th century, the Amber Room began as a Prussian royal installation composed of intricately arranged amber panels, gold leaf, and mirrored detailing. It was later presented as a diplomatic gift to Russia and installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, where it became one of the most recognized interior works of its time. The chamber's surfaces, assembled from carved amber pieces backed with gilded frameworks, reflected light in a way that made the room appear almost luminous, reinforcing its reputation as both a cultural and artistic achievement. Contemporary descriptions often emphasize not just its craftsmanship, but its symbolic value as an object of prestige, representing both wealth and diplomatic exchange between European powers. During the German advance into Soviet territory in 1941, the chamber was carefully taken apart by specialized units and prepared for transport under controlled conditions. Historical records confirm that the panels were packed into crates and relocated to Königsberg, then part of East Prussia, where they were reassembled and displayed for a period within the city's castle complex. At this stage, the movement of the Amber Room remained fully documented, with its presence accounted for in both military records and eyewitness reports. Photographic evidence and official documentation further reinforced the certainty of its location during this phase, making its later disappearance all the more difficult to reconcile. By the later years of the war, the trail of the Amber Room becomes increasingly uncertain as Königsberg faced sustained bombing and rapid military collapse. Allied air raids caused extensive damage to the city, including the castle where the chamber had been housed, leading to early claims that the room may have been destroyed during the bombardment. However, subsequent accounts introduced conflicting possibilities, suggesting that the chamber may have been dismantled again and moved before the city fell, possibly as part of broader evacuation efforts involving valuable assets. The lack of consistent documentation from this period reflects the broader breakdown of administrative control, where decisions were made quickly and often without record. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Soviet investigative teams initiated extensive efforts to determine whether the chamber had been destroyed or relocated. Early conclusions leaned toward the possibility of destruction, based largely on the condition of the Königsberg castle ruins and the absence of visible remains. Yet these findings remained inconclusive, as no definitive fragments of the amber panels were recovered from the site, and no verified documentation confirmed their destruction. This gap between expectation and evidence introduced the first sustained uncertainty, where official conclusions did not fully align with physical findings. Search efforts throughout the mid-20th century expanded into underground bunkers, abandoned military facilities, and concealed storage sites across former German territories. Investigators focused on documented transport routes and logistical patterns used during the evacuation of valuable materials in the final months of the war, particularly those leading away from Königsberg before its fall. Numerous locations were examined, including fortified underground systems designed to protect sensitive assets from aerial bombardment, yet none yielded verified evidence of the Amber Room's survival beyond its last confirmed appearance. Each failed search added detail to the broader picture, but did not narrow the field of possibilities. Attention gradually shifted toward the possibility that the chamber may have been hidden within collapsed structures or sealed environments beneath wartime ruins. As cities across Eastern Europe were rebuilt over the decades, the idea that remnants of the chamber could exist within inaccessible or buried spaces gained traction among researchers and independent investigators. Some hypotheses suggested that the room could have been stored in underground tunnels, mines, or reinforced bunkers that were later abandoned, sealed, or destroyed during the closing stages of the war. This line of inquiry introduced a different kind of search, one focused on spaces that are physically present but no longer accessible in their original form. Modern expeditions have incorporated advanced detection methods, including ground-penetrating radar, structural scanning, and archival reconstruction, to examine locations previously inaccessible or overlooked. These techniques have been applied to suspected bunker systems, former military sites, and subsurface anomalies identified through historical mapping and wartime records. In some cases, investigations have revealed hidden chambers or sealed corridors, yet none have produced evidence that can be directly linked to the Amber Room. The continued reliance on indirect detection methods reflects the challenge of investigating sites where excavation is limited or impractical. Despite numerous claims of discovery over the decades, no recovered material has been verified as belonging to the original Amber Room. Fragments presented as possible remnants have failed to withstand detailed analysis or have lacked sufficient provenance to establish authenticity. In several cases, discoveries initially presented as breakthroughs were later dismissed after closer examination, reinforcing the difficulty of verifying findings in a case defined by incomplete records and high historical visibility. The distinction between confirmed evidence and speculative association remains central to the investigation. Rather than leading to resolution, the accumulation of searches, theories, and partial findings has only reinforced the uncertainty surrounding the chamber's final location. Its existence is not in question, nor is its removal from its original setting, yet the final stage of its movement remains undefined within the historical record. The result is a disappearance that does not rely on ancient gaps or cultural secrecy, but on a precise sequence of events that simply stops before reaching a conclusion. An artifact once fully assembled and recorded now persists only in the uncertainty surrounding how its story was never completed. The hidden tomb of Attila the Hun. Few historical figures are associated with such a precisely described burial, and yet leave behind no identifiable physical trace as Attila the Hun, whose death in the 5th century initiated a search that continues without a defined location. Modern expeditions across Central and Eastern Europe have attempted to align scattered historical references with geography, yet the absence of any confirmed site has left the investigation dependent on written accounts rather than material evidence. In this case, the search does not begin with ruins or artifacts, but with a narrative that appears detailed enough to guide discovery, while never fully leading to it, creating a form of investigation that follows description rather than physical remains. Attila's rise to power positioned him at the centre of a vast and mobile empire that extended across large portions of Central and Eastern Europe, operating without a fixed administrative capital. His influence reached into Roman territories, shaping diplomatic and military interactions in ways that were recorded by both Roman and later historians. However, the nature of the Hunnic political structure, which relied on mobility rather than permanent urban centres, left behind fewer durable records than those of contemporary empires. This absence of centralised documentation contributes directly to the difficulty of locating any site associated with his burial, as there are no administrative archives or monumental structures that might anchor the search to a single location. One of the most frequently cited accounts of Attila's burial originates from later historical writings that describe a highly structured funerary process following his death. These sources, including the work of Jordanes, who drew from earlier accounts, outline a ceremonial sequence in which the burial was conducted with significant attention to secrecy and symbolic meaning, including references to the use of multiple coffins made of different materials and the inclusion of valuable items. While these details provide a framework for understanding how the burial may have been carried out, they are preserved in text written after the event, raising questions about how much of the account reflects direct knowledge and how much reflects narrative tradition shaped over time. According to these narratives, a distinctive element of the burial involved the temporary diversion of a river to create a concealed grave beneath its original course. The story describes a process in which the flow of water was redirected, the burial conducted in the exposed riverbed, and the river then allowed to return to its original path, effectively covering the site. Some versions of the account also include references to the elimination of those involved in the burial process, though such details are presented cautiously by historians as part of the narrative tradition, rather than confirmed historical fact. Even when approached critically, the account consistently emphasizes concealment through environment rather than structure. Interpretation of the river burial account has remained a subject of ongoing debate, with some historians viewing it as a literal description and others as a symbolic construction shaped by storytelling conventions. The logistical challenges of diverting a river, particularly on the scale implied by the narrative, have led to skepticism regarding its feasibility without leaving detectable traces. At the same time, smaller-scale water diversion practices were known in ancient contexts, making it difficult to dismiss the account entirely. This ambiguity places the burial in a space where practical limitations and historical possibility overlap without resolving into certainty. No confirmed archaeological evidence has ever been recovered that can be directly linked to Attila's burial, despite the level of detail present in historical descriptions. Excavations across regions associated with Hunnic activity have identified settlements, artifacts and burial sites from the broader period, yet none have been attributed to Attila himself. The absence is particularly notable given the scale of his influence, as figures of comparable prominence are often associated with identifiable burial locations or material remains. In this case, the expected correlation between historical significance and archaeological visibility does not appear. Geographical uncertainty further complicates the search, as the extent of the Hunnic domain during Attila's lifetime covered regions that now span multiple modern countries, including areas within present-day Hungary, Romania, and surrounding territories. The mobility of his forces and the lack of permanent political centres mean that no single location can be definitively associated with his final moments. Rivers themselves, which play a central role in the burial narrative, have shifted course over centuries due to natural processes such as erosion, flooding, and sediment deposition, potentially altering or obscuring any site that may once have existed beneath their paths. Modern archaeological expeditions have examined river systems, plains, and historically significant regions associated with Hunnic activity, yet none have produced conclusive findings. Surveys have focused on areas where burial traditions might align with the historical descriptions, including regions where ancient river paths can be reconstructed through geological and environmental analysis. Even with these methods, the ability to identify a specific burial beneath layers of sediment and time remains limited, particularly when no surface indicators or associated artifacts are present to guide excavation. The reliance on sources written after Attila's death introduces additional complexity, as these accounts blend observation with narrative tradition in ways that are not always easily separated. Historians must navigate between accepting the descriptions as meaningful historical clues and recognizing the possibility that elements of the story were shaped by literary conventions or cultural expectations. The portrayal of Attila himself in these sources often reflects a combination of historical figure and symbolic representation, further complicating the interpretation of details surrounding his burial. As the search continues without material confirmation, the burial of Attila occupies a space where historical description persists without physical verification. The account remains detailed enough to suggest that something occurred in a specific and deliberate way, yet the absence of any corresponding evidence prevents it from being fully established as a historical reality. The result is a form of historical presence that exists through narrative continuity rather than physical discovery, where each attempt to locate the burial returns to the same unresolved boundary. Attila the Hun's burial is recorded in careful detail, yet no part of it has ever been physically confirmed: the uncertain burial of Pharaoh Sanakht. Within the earliest layers of Egyptian dynastic history, Pharaoh Sanakht appears as a figure whose reign is recorded, yet whose burial context remains unresolved within modern archaeological interpretation. Expeditions and scholarly investigations into early 3rd Dynasty sites have attempted to connect fragmentary evidence with his name, but the search unfolds differently from later royal tomb discoveries. Instead of tracing a known structure or a documented burial site, researchers work within a field defined by partial inscriptions, disputed identifications, and gaps that begin at the very foundation of recorded Egyptian history. In this environment, even the starting point of the investigation remains uncertain, shaped as much by what is missing as by what survives. Emerging during the formative phase of the Old Kingdom, Sanakht is placed within a period where royal burial traditions were still undergoing structural development and formal definition. This was an era that preceded the standardization seen in later pyramid complexes, when funerary architecture was still evolving in scale, form, and symbolic meaning. As a result, the physical markers typically used to identify royal burials, inscriptions, layout consistency, and monument clarity, are less reliable when applied to rulers from this early stage, leaving room for multiple interpretations. The transition from earlier mastaba forms toward more complex constructions was not uniform, and attribution becomes more difficult when architectural experimentation overlaps with incomplete records. Preservation of early dynastic records is limited, and references to Sanakht survive primarily through later king lists that often differ in sequence and attribution. These lists, compiled generations after the reigns they describe, were shaped by both historical memory and political priorities, introducing inconsistencies that complicate identification. In some cases, names appear in altered forms or are omitted entirely, making it difficult to determine whether Sanakht's recorded presence corresponds directly to a single individual or reflects a broader interpretive reconstruction. The possibility that names were modified, merged, or reassigned over time adds another layer of uncertainty, where even the identity of the ruler becomes part of the investigation. Archaeological attempts to associate Sanakht with specific burial sites have produced multiple hypotheses, none of which have achieved definitive confirmation. Certain early dynastic tombs have been proposed based on proximity, structural characteristics, or fragmentary inscriptions, yet each proposed identification remains subject to revision. Without a clear inscriptional link naming Sanakht within a burial context, these associations rely on indirect evidence that does not meet the threshold required for certainty. Even when architectural features appear consistent with a royal burial, the absence of explicit identification leaves the connection unresolved. Skeletal remains discovered in early dynastic contexts have occasionally been linked to Sanakht, though biological and chronological analyses continue to produce conflicting interpretations. One such set of remains, notable for its unusual height compared to typical skeletal measurements from the period, has been considered as a possible candidate. Some researchers have explored whether this physical characteristic could align with descriptions of elite individuals, while others caution against drawing conclusions without direct evidence. The remains themselves do not carry inscriptions or markers that confirm identity, leaving their association dependent on circumstantial interpretation rather than definitive proof. Reconstruction of Egypt's 3rd Dynasty chronology is complicated by gaps in documentation that affect how individual rulers and their burials are positioned within historical frameworks. Unlike later periods where inscriptions, monuments, and administrative records create a more continuous narrative, this early phase contains interruptions that obscure the sequence of reigns. Scholars often rely on cross-referencing fragmentary sources, including inscriptions found in later contexts, to reconstruct a timeline that remains open to revision. This uncertainty extends beyond Sanakht's burial and into the broader understanding of the dynasty itself, where even the order of succession is not universally agreed upon. Development of royal burial architecture during this era reflects experimentation with forms that predate standardized pyramid construction. Early mastaba structures, evolving burial chambers, and transitional designs indicate that royal funerary practices were still being established. Some sites associated with the 3rd Dynasty display features that suggest a shift toward more monumental construction, yet the attribution of these developments to specific rulers remains uncertain. In this context, The absence of a clearly defined tomb for Sanakht may reflect the transitional nature of the period, where architectural identity had not yet fully stabilized. Modern reassessments of early Egyptian burial sites have revised earlier identifications, often separating previously assumed connections between remains and named rulers. Advances in archaeological methodology, including improved dating techniques and more detailed analysis of construction phases, have led to the re-evaluation of earlier conclusions. In several cases, tombs once tentatively linked to specific rulers have been reassigned or left unclassified, reinforcing the uncertainty surrounding figures like Sanakht. Each revision narrows some possibilities while reopening others, maintaining a cycle of interpretation rather than resolution. Scholarly interpretations of Sanakht's historical presence continue to depend on indirect evidence, rather than a clearly attributed funerary discovery. The combination of limited inscriptions, disputed identifications, and evolving archaeological frameworks means that each piece of evidence must be considered within a broader context of uncertainty. This creates a situation where the figure is acknowledged within historical records, yet remains only partially anchored within the physical landscape of early Egypt. The investigation becomes less about uncovering a hidden structure, and more about determining whether the available evidence can ever converge into a single, consistent conclusion. Rather than pointing toward a single location, the available evidence disperses the possibility of Sanakht's burial across multiple interpretations that never fully align. His presence is established through records that survive in fragmented form, while the physical evidence that might define his burial remains unverified. The search in this case does not narrow with time, but instead expands into competing explanations that reflect the limits of early historical reconstruction. The name of Pharaoh Sanakht is preserved in ancient records, yet no burial site can be definitively linked to him. The ruins of Uruk and the first clues of Gilgamesh. Long before the figure of Gilgamesh was considered within a historical framework, the ruins of Uruk stood as one of the earliest archaeological sites to reveal the scale of early urban civilization in Mesopotamia. Systematic expeditions to the site, particularly those carried out in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, began to expose layers of occupation that stretched deep into the earliest phases of organized city life. German archaeological teams, working under challenging conditions, gradually uncovered vast sections of the ancient settlement, documenting architectural remains that extended across multiple phases of construction. What these investigations revealed was not a single structure or isolated discovery, but an entire landscape of development, where architecture, administration, and early writing systems began to take recognizable form. Within this setting, the possibility emerged that figures once confined to literary tradition might have connections to a real and identifiable past, embedded within the earliest foundations of urban society. Excavations at Uruk uncovered the remains of a city that once functioned as a major center of political, economic, and cultural activity during the 4th millennium BCE. The scale of the site, with its monumental buildings and evidence of organized labor, indicated a level of complexity that aligned with early accounts of powerful rulers and structured governance. Large temple complexes, including those associated with the Eanna district, suggested centralized religious and administrative authority, where economic activity and ritual practice were closely linked. Layers of construction revealed continuous occupation and expansion, with older structures often buried beneath later developments, creating a vertical record of the city's evolution over time. This pattern of rebuilding and expansion demonstrated not only longevity, but an ability to sustain complex social organization across generations. These findings established a physical context in which early kings, whether fully documented or not, could be understood as part of an evolving historical reality. Among the most significant discoveries at the site were early cuneiform tablets that preserved some of the earliest known forms of written communication. These texts, though often administrative in nature, provided insight into systems of record-keeping, trade, and governance that defined the functioning of the city. Many of the earliest tablets consist of numerical accounts, lists of goods, and records of labor distribution, reflecting a society increasingly dependent on structured management and documentation. While they did not directly describe the figure of Gilgamesh in their earliest forms, they demonstrated that writing had already begun to capture aspects of leadership and organization in ways that could later support narrative development. Over time, as writing systems became more refined and expressive, The transition from record to narrative allowed figures like Gilgamesh to emerge within a literary tradition that extended beyond simple documentation, preserving memory in a form that could evolve across generations. Within later copies of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh presents a figure whose actions extend beyond ordinary human experience. The narrative describes a ruler of Uruk whose strength, authority, and encounters with both human and supernatural elements position him within a mythological framework. Episodes involving journeys beyond the known world, confrontations with divine beings, and reflections on mortality place the figure firmly within the realm of epic storytelling. For much of early scholarship, this portrayal reinforced the idea that Gilgamesh belonged entirely to legend, existing as a symbolic figure rather than a historical one. However, the consistent association of the character with a real city introduced a point of tension between narrative and geography, suggesting that the story may have been anchored, at least in part, in an existing tradition tied to a known location. The inclusion of Gilgamesh in the Sumerian king list introduces a different perspective, placing him among rulers who are presented as part of a historical sequence. This list, which records kings and their reigns across various cities, combines elements of historical record with extended or symbolic reign lengths that complicate direct interpretation. Some rulers are assigned implausibly long periods of rule, indicating that the document blends memory with tradition in a way that resists straightforward classification. Even so, the presence of Gilgamesh within this framework distinguishes him from purely mythological figures, indicating that his name was preserved in a context that attempted to document political succession. The challenge lies in determining how much of this record reflects historical reality, and how much has been shaped by later narrative influence layered onto earlier traditions. Connections between archaeological findings at Uruk and names preserved in early texts have prompted ongoing attempts to identify points of overlap between material evidence and recorded tradition. In some cases, inscriptions referencing rulers or administrative systems provide indirect support for the existence of figures named in literary sources. Seal impressions, administrative markings, and references to authority structures suggest a hierarchy consistent with early kingship, even if individual identities remain uncertain. While no inscription has definitively confirmed Gilgamesh as a historically verified individual, the convergence of location, chronology, and recorded names suggests that the boundary between myth and history may not be as clearly defined as once assumed. Each fragment contributes to a broader pattern, without resolving it completely, reinforcing the sense of partial alignment rather than full confirmation. Descriptions of massive city walls attributed to Gilgamesh in literary sources have often been compared with the large-scale fortifications uncovered at Uruk. Archaeological evidence confirms the existence of extensive defensive structures surrounding the city, reflecting both its importance and the organizational capacity required to construct them. These walls, built from mud brick and reinforced over time, indicate coordinated labor on a scale that implies centralized authority. While these structures cannot be directly linked to a single ruler, their presence aligns with descriptions that portray Uruk as a city shaped by monumental effort. The association between text and structure does not provide confirmation, but it reinforces the possibility that elements of the narrative correspond to real features of the ancient landscape that were preserved in memory and later incorporated into literary form. Interpreting early Mesopotamian evidence requires navigating a landscape where oral tradition, written record, and archaeological discovery intersect without clear boundaries. Stories that may have originated as historical accounts could have been reshaped through generations of retelling before being committed to writing, introducing layers of interpretation that obscure their original form. At the same time, archaeological discoveries provide tangible evidence of a complex society capable of producing both historical records and enduring narratives. The interaction between these elements creates a framework in which certainty remains limited, but connections continue to emerge, suggesting that the separation between history and story may be less distinct than it appears. Modern scholarship increasingly considers the possibility that Gilgamesh may have been based on an actual ruler whose historical identity became layered with narrative elements over time. Rather than viewing the figure as entirely fictional or fully historical, researchers often approach the subject as a combination of both, where a real individual may have inspired a tradition that expanded beyond verifiable events. This perspective allows for the coexistence of myth and history, acknowledging that early records may preserve traces of reality, even when they cannot be fully confirmed. It also reflects a broader understanding of how ancient societies recorded their past, where memory, symbolism, and documentation were often intertwined. As fragments of text and physical remains continue to be examined together, the figure associated with Gilgamesh begins to shift from legend toward a more grounded historical presence. The process is gradual and remains incomplete, shaped by discoveries that provide context without delivering final answers. Each new analysis refines the outline without fully defining it, leaving gaps that continue to invite interpretation. What emerges is not a definitive identification, but a developing form where the accumulation of evidence suggests direction without establishing certainty. Within the ruins of Uruk, the name of Gilgamesh begins to take form, carried by traces that have yet to fully define who he was. The historical king behind the legend of Gilgamesh. At a certain point in the study of early Mesopotamia, attention shifts from what has been uncovered in the ground to what can be confirmed within the records that survived. Following the excavation of Uruk and the recovery of early written materials, scholarly expeditions increasingly turn toward the comparison of texts rather than terrain, attempting to determine whether the figure of Gilgamesh could be placed within a verifiable historical framework. This phase of investigation does not rely on uncovering a hidden structure or locating a lost tomb, but instead on examining the consistency, origin, and intent of the records that carry his name. In this sense, the search becomes less about discovery and more about interpretation, where each source must be evaluated not only for what it says, but for how and why it was preserved. The question is no longer whether the name exists, but whether the context in which it appears can sustain historical meaning. The Sumerian king list presents one of the earliest structured attempts to document rulers and their reigns across successive cities. Compiled in multiple versions over time and preserved on clay tablets written in cuneiform script, the list reflects a tradition of recording kingship as something that moved between centers of power, creating a continuous narrative of authority. Among these entries appears the name of Gilgamesh, identified as a king of Uruk, suggesting that his name was preserved within a framework that sought to organize political history. However, the existence of several variations of the list, each with differences in sequence, wording, and detail, introduces uncertainty about how stable or consistent this record truly is. Some versions appear to have been copied and adapted for different regions or periods, indicating that the list itself was not a fixed document, but one that evolved alongside the traditions it attempted to preserve. Within this document, the nature of kingship is not entirely consistent, as earlier entries include figures associated with reigns that extend far beyond realistic human lifespans. Some rulers are described as governing for hundreds or even thousands of years, reflecting a framework that blends symbolic meaning with recorded succession. This pattern complicates the interpretation of every name that follows, as the list does not clearly separate historical record from narrative convention. In some versions, the transition from these exaggerated reigns to shorter, more plausible durations appears gradual rather than abrupt, making it difficult to determine whether this shift reflects a change in record-keeping practices or a reinterpretation of earlier traditions. The structure of the list suggests an attempt to impose order on a past that may have already been shaped by storytelling before it was formally recorded. Positioned among these entries, the name of Gilgamesh appears in a section where the transition between mythological duration and more plausible rule begins to take shape. His recorded reign, while still extended beyond typical expectations, is shorter than those attributed to earlier kings, suggesting a movement toward a more grounded chronology. This placement has led some researchers to consider the possibility that Gilgamesh belongs to a period where historical memory was becoming more structured, even if it remained influenced by earlier symbolic elements. At the same time, the lack of consistency across different versions of the list prevents this interpretation from being confirmed with certainty. The ambiguity of his placement reflects a broader uncertainty about where narrative tradition ends and historical record begins. In contrast to administrative records, the Epic of Gilgamesh portrays its central figure through a narrative that incorporates both human and supernatural elements. The text, preserved through multiple copies written in Akkadian and derived from earlier Sumerian compositions, reflects a long process of transmission and adaptation. These copies were produced over centuries by scribes who worked within established traditions of literary preservation, often copying earlier tablets while introducing variations that reflected their own time and context. Within the epic, Gilgamesh is described as a powerful ruler whose actions extend beyond ordinary experience, including encounters with divine figures and journeys into distant and unfamiliar realms. These elements position the character within a literary tradition that emphasizes meaning, mortality, and the limits of human power rather than historical documentation. Comparison between the literary and historical sources reveals a shared foundation in name and location, while diverging significantly in characterization and detail. Both the king list and the epic associate Gilgamesh with Uruk, reinforcing the connection between the figure and a real city, identified through archaeological excavation. However, the epic expands this association into a narrative that reshapes the figure into something larger than a historical ruler, while the king list reduces him to a single entry within a structured sequence. This contrast highlights the difficulty of determining whether the shared elements represent a common historical origin or a convergence of tradition around a recognizable name. It also reflects the different purposes of each source, where one seeks to record succession and the other to explore themes that extend beyond recorded history. Despite the convergence of textual references, no inscription or artifact has been definitively identified as belonging to a ruler named Gilgamesh. Excavations at Uruk and surrounding regions have produced evidence of early kingship, including administrative tablets, seal impressions, and architectural remains that indicate organized governance. Yet none of these findings provide a direct connection to the name preserved in either the king list or the epic. This absence becomes more significant when considered alongside the expectation that a ruler of such prominence, if historical, might have left clearer traces within the archaeological record. In the context of early Mesopotamian documentation, where even fragmentary references to lesser figures have survived, the lack of a direct mention adds to the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Interpretations among scholars vary, with some proposing that the figure reflects a real king whose story expanded through oral tradition before being written down. In this view, an individual who once ruled Uruk may have served as the foundation for a narrative that accumulated symbolic and mythological elements over time. Others argue that the figure may have originated within the tradition itself, shaped by recurring themes of kingship, power, and mortality, rather than by a specific historical person. The process of oral transmission, which preceded the earliest written versions of these texts, allowed stories to be reshaped across generations, preserving certain elements while altering others. This dynamic makes it difficult to isolate an original version that could be directly compared with historical evidence. The role of scribes in preserving and transmitting these texts introduces another layer of complexity. Writing in ancient Mesopotamia was not only a practical tool for administration, but also a specialized skill associated with trained individuals who operated within established traditions. As texts were copied and recopied, variations could emerge, whether through intentional adaptation or gradual alteration. These changes do not necessarily diminish the value of the texts, but they complicate efforts to trace them back to a single, fixed origin. In this context, the figure of Gilgamesh becomes part of a tradition that was continuously shaped by those who preserved it. Over time, the blending of memory, narrative, and record has produced a figure that cannot be easily separated into purely historical or purely mythological categories. Oral traditions, transmitted across generations before being recorded, may have preserved fragments of real events while altering their structure and meaning. The process of writing these traditions introduced additional layers as scribes adapted and reinterpreted earlier material within new contexts. As a result, the figure of Gilgamesh exists not as a fixed identity, but as a composite shaped by multiple stages of preservation and transformation. This layered development reflects the broader nature of early historical records, where clarity is often replaced by accumulation. As both lines of evidence continue to be examined, the identity associated with Gilgamesh remains defined by partial alignment rather than complete confirmation. The name appears within a document that attempts to record political succession, while the character dominates a narrative that explores themes beyond historical record. Between these forms, a connection persists, but it does not resolve into a singular, verifiable figure. Instead, it reflects a point where early history and evolving tradition intersect without fully merging. Gilgamesh stands between historical record and legend, where neither fully resolves who he was, the fragmented death and burial of Gilgamesh. Beyond the question of whether Gilgamesh was a historical figure lies a quieter set of texts that attempt to describe how his life ended and how his body was placed into burial. In the course of broader Mesopotamian studies, certain scholarly efforts shifted toward reconstructing these final moments from fragmentary sources rather than searching for material remains in the ground. This phase of inquiry does not begin with excavation, but with translation, comparison, and the careful assembly of incomplete lines preserved across damaged tablets. What emerges from this process is not a continuous narrative, but a partial account shaped by what survived and what did not. Ancient Sumerian compositions, preserved only in incomplete and scattered tablets, contain references to the death of a king associated with Uruk, whose description aligns with the figure later known as Gilgamesh. These fragments do not exist as a single unified text, but as pieces distributed across different collections, often separated by time and context. Some lines are preserved in better condition than others, while certain sections remain entirely lost, leaving transitions between events unclear. Despite these gaps, recurring elements within the surviving material suggest that the death of this figure was understood as a significant and carefully recorded event. Unlike the more widely known epic narratives, these fragments focus less on heroic journeys and more on the final moments of a ruler whose death is presented as an event of both political and ritual importance. The tone shifts away from exploration and confrontation, turning instead toward the actions that follow the end of a king's life. In this context, the emphasis appears to rest on the processes that ensure continuity after death, including the treatment of the body, the performance of rites, and the establishment of a lasting place within memory. The fragments suggest that death, rather than diminishing the figure, marked a transition into another form of significance. Within these surviving lines, descriptions emerge of funerary rites that suggest a burial process shaped by ritual, status, and the need to preserve memory within an early urban society. Although incomplete, the references indicate a sequence of actions that may have involved preparation of the body, ceremonial acknowledgement, and placement within a defined space. These elements reflect broader patterns seen in early Mesopotamian burial traditions, where social hierarchy influenced both the treatment of the dead and the nature of their interment. Even without full detail, the fragments imply that the burial was not a simple act, but part of a structured response to the death of a ruler. One recurring element within these interpretations involves the possible association between royal burial and controlled water environments, a detail that has drawn particular attention from researchers. Certain lines have been understood to suggest a connection between the burial site and a space influenced or defined by water, though the exact meaning of this association remains uncertain. In early Mesopotamian contexts, water was not only a practical feature of the landscape but also a symbolic one, connected to ideas of origin, boundary, and transition. The presence of such imagery within burial descriptions introduces the possibility that the location of interment may have held both physical and symbolic significance. Interpretations of these passages have led some scholars to consider whether the burial described may have involved the temporary diversion or containment of water, though the texts themselves remain incomplete and open to multiple readings. This idea emerges not from a single clear statement, but from the combination of references that, when viewed together, suggest an interaction between constructed space and the surrounding environment. In practical terms, such an undertaking would have required coordination and labour consistent with organised authority, aligning with what is known of early urban societies. At the same time, the absence of complete lines prevents this interpretation from being confirmed, leaving it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. Gaps within the surviving tablets leave critical portions of the account missing, forcing any reconstruction of events to rely on partial lines and comparative analysis with other Mesopotamian traditions. Sections that might describe the precise location, structure, or sequence of burial are either damaged or entirely absent, interrupting the continuity of the narrative. As a result, researchers must rely on parallels from other texts and archaeological findings to fill in the spaces between surviving fragments. This method allows for informed interpretation, but it also introduces uncertainty, as the reconstructed sequence may not fully reflect the original account. When examined alongside known burial practices of the region, the descriptions neither fully align with typical interment patterns nor clearly contradict them, creating a space of ambiguity. Early Mesopotamian burials vary widely, from simple interments beneath domestic floors to more elaborate contexts associated with status and authority. The fragments associated with Gilgamesh appear to suggest a burial that stands apart in some respects, yet they do not provide enough detail to define it as entirely unique. This partial alignment reinforces the difficulty of placing the account within a clear framework, as it remains positioned between known practice and uncertain variation. Later, literary adaptations shift focus away from these details, emphasizing themes of mortality and legacy rather than preserving a clear account of burial. As the figure of Gilgamesh becomes more deeply embedded in narrative tradition, the specifics of his death and interment become less central than the broader meaning of his story. The transformation of the character across successive versions of the text reflects changing priorities, where the exploration of human limits and the inevitability of death take precedence over the preservation of historical or procedural detail. In this process, earlier references to burial become less distinct, absorbed into a narrative that no longer depends on them. Because no complete version of the original account survives, the narrative of Gilgamesh's death and burial exists only as a series of disconnected references. Each fragment contributes a small portion of the larger picture, yet none provides a complete view of the event it describes. The absence of continuity means that interpretation must remain provisional, shaped by what can be inferred rather than what can be directly confirmed. This condition reflects a broader pattern within early historical study, where the survival of evidence determines not only what is known, but how it can be understood. Even as these fragments continue to be examined, their limitations define the boundaries of what can be concluded. The descriptions they contain suggest intention, structure, and significance, yet they stop short of providing the clarity needed to reconstruct a definitive account. What remains is a record shaped as much by loss as by preservation, where the most critical details exist at the edges of what can still be read. In this sense, the account of Gilgamesh's burial does not resolve into a single narrative, but remains suspended within the fragments that carry it forward. The death and burial of Gilgamesh are preserved only in fragments, describing a resting place that was recorded yet never fully retained. The expedition that searched for the tomb of Gilgamesh. Gradually, the focus of investigation shifts from establishing whether Gilgamesh existed to determining where his burial might be located within the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeological expeditions working across southern Iraq, particularly in and around the ruins of Uruk, began to approach the question from a different direction, treating the figure not only as a subject of text, but as a ruler who may have followed burial practices consistent with his time. This transition marks a change in the nature of the search, where the absence of a confirmed tomb does not end the inquiry, but instead redirects it toward patterns, environments, and expectations that could guide a more focused investigation. In this way, the search becomes less dependent on a single discovery and more reliant on the gradual alignment of multiple forms of evidence. Field teams working in the region often approach the problem indirectly, prioritizing landscape analysis and contextual probability over the expectation of a clearly defined burial structure. Royal burial practices in early Mesopotamian societies differed significantly from later traditions that relied on monumental tomb structures. Unlike the large and clearly defined burial complexes seen in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamian elites were often interred in ways that left fewer visible markers above ground. Burials could take place beneath floors, within city limits, or in areas that were later built over, making long-term identification difficult. In some cases, grave goods or burial chambers were modest compared to later royal traditions, further reducing the likelihood of clear identification. This lack of monumental permanence means that even high-status individuals might not be associated with easily recognizable burial sites, complicating efforts to locate the resting place of a figure like Gilgamesh. The passage of time, combined with continuous habitation, often results in earlier burial contexts becoming absorbed into later architectural layers without leaving distinct surface indicators. Among the many ancient cities associated with early kingship, Uruk emerges as the most consistent point of reference connected to the figure of Gilgamesh. The city's scale, its role in early urban development, and its repeated association with the name in literary and historical sources make it the primary focus of archaeological attention. Excavations have revealed extensive architectural remains, including temples, administrative buildings, and defensive structures, all of which point to a complex and organized society. Beneath these visible layers lie earlier phases of construction, indicating that the city was rebuilt and expanded over long periods, potentially concealing earlier burial context beneath later developments. The depth of accumulated occupation means that some areas remain only partially explored, with lower layers accessible only through careful and limited excavation. Within this environment, the possibility of a royal burial exists, but it is not immediately visible within the existing layout. Within and around the remains of Uruk, archaeologists have identified zones where elite burials are more likely to have been placed based on patterns observed in comparable sites. Areas near significant structures such as temple complexes or administrative centres are often considered likely candidates due to their association with authority and status. At the same time, the density of occupation within the city means that many potential burial locations may now lie beneath later layers of construction, obscured by centuries of continuous use. In other Mesopotamian cities, elite burials have sometimes been found in locations that were not initially considered significant, suggesting that assumptions about placement must remain flexible. This overlapping of time complicates the process of isolating a specific burial site within a landscape that has been repeatedly reshaped. The uncertainty surrounding burial placement reinforces the need to interpret each location within its broader architectural and cultural context. Initial excavation efforts in Mesopotamia were conducted under conditions that often limited the precision and documentation of findings. Early archaeologists focused on uncovering major structures and artifacts, sometimes without the detailed recording methods that would later become standard practice. As a result, some areas were disturbed or incompletely documented, leaving gaps in the record that affect current interpretations. In certain cases, smaller features that might indicate burial contexts were not recognized or preserved, meaning that potentially significant evidence could have been overlooked. These limitations mean that certain potential burial sites may have been identified without being fully understood or passed over entirely during the earliest phases of exploration. The legacy of these early methods continues to influence how modern researchers interpret the site today. Subsequent archaeological surveys introduced more refined methods, allowing researchers to reassess earlier excavation areas with greater accuracy. Advances in mapping, stratigraphic analysis, and environmental reconstruction have made it possible to identify subtle features that might indicate the presence of burials. Techniques such as ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, when applied under suitable conditions, can reveal anomalies beneath the surface that are not visible through excavation alone. Remote sensing techniques and careful re-examination of excavation records have allowed archaeologists to revisit previously explored zones with a new perspective. These techniques have been applied to regions within and around Uruk in an effort to locate areas that align with expected patterns of elite interment. While these efforts have not yet produced a confirmed tomb, they have contributed to a more detailed understanding of where such a burial might be located and how it may be concealed within the site. Running alongside the ancient city, the Euphrates River has played a significant role in shaping both the environment and the preservation of potential burial sites. Over time, the river has shifted its course due to natural processes such as erosion and sediment deposition, altering the landscape in ways that can obscure or displace archaeological features. Areas that may once have been suitable for burial could now lie beneath layers of sediment or outside the present boundaries of the site. In some cases, entire sections of ancient terrain may have been eroded or buried beyond easy recovery, making it difficult to determine the original relationship between the city and its surrounding landscape. Seasonal flooding and long-term hydrological changes further complicate excavation, affecting both access and preservation. This dynamic environment introduces an additional layer of complexity, as the original context of any burial may no longer be visible in its original form. As data from multiple investigations are compared, certain areas within the broader region begin to stand out as more consistent with expected burial patterns. These zones are identified not through direct evidence, but through the convergence of environmental factors, architectural context, and historical association. The process does not isolate a single location, but it reduces the range of possibilities, allowing researchers to focus their attention more narrowly. Patterns observed in other early urban centres also inform this narrowing process, providing comparative frameworks that help define what a royal burial site might look like under similar conditions. Each refinement brings the investigation closer to a set of locations that align with both the archaeological record and the expectations derived from historical sources, even if confirmation remains out of reach. Despite the absence of a confirmed tomb, some findings suggest that the search may be approaching a location of particular significance. Subtle variations in soil composition, structural anomalies, and the arrangement of surrounding features can indicate the presence of something beneath the surface that has yet to be fully uncovered. These indicators do not provide direct answers, but they contribute to a growing sense that the search is moving within a more defined area. At the same time, similar signals in other contexts have sometimes led to inconclusive results, reinforcing the need for careful interpretation. The challenge lies in determining whether these signals correspond to a burial of importance or to other forms of buried structure that reflect the complexity of the site. The distinction between meaningful anomaly and natural variation remains one of the central difficulties in this stage of investigation. With each layer of analysis narrowing the field, the investigation increasingly concentrates on a smaller set of possibilities that align with both textual and archaeological expectations. The search no longer extends across an undefined landscape, but instead moves within boundaries shaped by accumulated evidence and refined interpretation. What remains uncertain is not where to look, but whether the site, once fully examined, will reveal a connection strong enough to confirm the identity of the figure long associated with it. Even as the focus sharpens, the absence of direct confirmation maintains the tension that has defined the search from the beginning, leaving the outcome suspended between expectation and uncertainty. The search continues to narrow toward a point where the question is no longer where to look, but whether what lies there will confirm what has long been suggested: the satellite discovery linked to the tomb of Gilgamesh. Decades into the effort to understand Gilgamesh, the investigation extends beyond excavation sites and into the analysis of landscapes viewed from orbit. Archaeological expeditions that once relied entirely on ground-based methods began, in the early 2000s, to incorporate satellite imaging as a way of examining large regions of Mesopotamia with greater scope and efficiency. This shift introduced a different kind of evidence, one that did not emerge from excavation layers, but from patterns visible only at a distance. Within this new perspective, areas surrounding the ancient city of Uruk were re-examined, not through trenches or tools, but through images that captured subtle variations across the surface of the land. These images, often collected over multiple passes and under different environmental conditions, allowed researchers to compare seasonal and structural changes that would otherwise go unnoticed at ground level. Satellite-based archaeology began to offer researchers a way to examine vast regions of Mesopotamia without disturbing the ground itself. By analysing differences in soil colour, elevation and vegetation, specialists could identify features that might indicate buried structures or ancient pathways. These methods proved especially valuable in environments where traditional excavation was limited by scale or accessibility. In regions where centuries of activity had altered the surface, satellite imagery provided a means of detecting patterns that were otherwise difficult to recognise from ground level. Techniques, such as multispectral imaging, allowed analysts to detect variations in moisture retention and soil composition, while radar-based systems could reveal subtle differences in surface texture. This approach did not replace excavation, but it introduced a preliminary stage in which potential sites could be identified before any physical investigation took place. During early 2000s imaging surveys, a set of patterns near the ancient city of Uruk drew attention for their unusual arrangement. The formation appeared as a series of linear outlines that contrasted with the surrounding terrain, suggesting a level of organisation not typically associated with natural processes. While the exact boundaries and structure were not fully defined, the alignment of these features indicated the possibility of a constructed space beneath the surface. The consistency of the lines across multiple images, taken at different times, suggested that the pattern was not the result of temporary surface conditions. For researchers familiar with the layout of ancient Mesopotamian cities, the configuration raised questions about whether the patterns corresponded to architectural remains that had yet to be uncovered. What distinguished this feature was not its scale alone, but the way its outline appeared to align with expectations of constructed space. The geometry suggested intentional design, with edges and proportions that differed from the irregular formations produced by erosion or sediment deposition. In comparison with known archaeological sites, the arrangement bore similarities to areas associated with significant structures, though it did not match any previously identified layout. In some interpretations, the spacing between lines hinted at enclosed sections or divisions that could correspond to functional zones within a larger structure. This combination of familiarity and uncertainty made the feature difficult to classify, placing it within a category that required further interpretation rather than immediate identification. Reports of this possible structure quickly circulated, drawing interest beyond academic circles and into wider public discussion. The idea that satellite imagery might have revealed a long-sought location connected to Gilgamesh attracted attention, particularly given the ongoing effort to locate a burial site associated with the figure. Media coverage often emphasized the potential significance of the discovery, sometimes presenting the formation as evidence of something more defined than the data could support. As the report spread, the distinction between observation and interpretation became less clear, contributing to a growing sense of anticipation around what had been detected. In some cases, simplified representations of the imagery were used to illustrate the feature, further reinforcing interpretations that extended beyond the original data. Archaeologists approach these claims with caution, emphasizing the difference between a detected anomaly and a verified archaeological site. While the patterns observed in the imagery were notable, they did not provide direct evidence of a tomb or any specific structure. Specialists in the field pointed out that similar features had been identified in other regions, where initial interpretations were later revised following closer analysis. The process of confirming a site requires multiple stages, including ground verification, stratigraphic evaluation, and controlled excavation, none of which had yet been applied to the area in question. Without these steps, the feature remained an observation rather than a confirmed discovery, existing within a category that demands further testing before any conclusion can be reached. Natural processes across the Mesopotamian landscape have long shaped surface patterns in ways that can resemble deliberate construction. Shifts in river courses, sediment accumulation, and variations in soil composition can create linear or geometric formations that appear structured when viewed from above. Over time, these processes can obscure or alter the remains of actual structures, blending natural and artificial elements into patterns that are difficult to separate. Agricultural activity, including repeated ploughing and irrigation, can also introduce regular patterns that mimic architectural outlines when viewed through satellite imagery. In regions like Uruk, where the landscape has undergone continuous change, distinguishing between these possibilities becomes a central challenge in interpreting satellite data. Efforts to investigate the area directly have been limited, leaving the observed feature without physical confirmation. Factors such as accessibility, environmental conditions, and broader regional circumstances have affected the ability to conduct detailed on-site examination. In addition, areas of archaeological interest are often subject to protection measures that restrict intrusive investigation until sufficient evidence justifies excavation. Without direct survey, the patterns identified in the imagery cannot be fully understood in terms of depth, composition, or function. This absence of ground verification reinforces the gap between detection and interpretation, where the presence of a feature does not necessarily indicate its origin or purpose. As interpretations continue, the detected formation remains a subject of debate rather than a defined discovery. Some researchers consider the possibility that the feature represents an unexcavated structure, consistent with early urban or elite contexts, while others remain cautious, pointing to the limitations of interpreting surface data without supporting evidence. The discussion reflects a broader challenge within archaeology, where new technologies expand the range of observation but also introduce new uncertainties. The increasing reliance on remote sensing requires careful calibration between what can be observed and what can be confirmed, ensuring that interpretation does not extend beyond the limits of the data. Viewed only through layers of imaging data, the structure occupies a space between recognition and uncertainty. It is visible enough to prompt investigation, yet indistinct enough to resist clear classification. The image suggests form, but not function, presence, but not identity. In the absence of direct evidence, the interpretation of what has been detected remains open, shaped by both the possibilities it presents and the limitations it imposes. Each additional image adds perspective, but not resolution, reinforcing the distance between observation and understanding. From above, something has been outlined, but its meaning has yet to be determined. The site beneath the Euphrates said to hold Gilgamesh. Within Mesopotamian archaeological research, certain attention has gradually shifted toward areas where ancient settlements may now lie beneath major river systems. As studies of southern Iraq continue to evolve, researchers examining the landscape around the historical city of Uruk have increasingly considered the possibility that key archaeological evidence may no longer rest on visible ground. Instead, it may be positioned beneath layers shaped by long-term environmental change, where water movement and sediment deposition have altered the original surface beyond easy recognition. In this context, the Euphrates is not only a geographic feature, but a force that has continuously rewritten the boundaries of the ancient world. The terrain visible today represents only the most recent phase of a landscape that has been repeatedly formed and reformed over thousands of years. Near the historical expanse of Uruk, stretches of land adjacent to the Euphrates have repeatedly surfaced in excavation reports as points of interest. These zones are not defined by a single discovery, but by their consistent appearance in multiple surveys and regional assessments over time. Their significance lies in their proximity to early urban development, where administrative, residential, and ceremonial spaces once formed part of a densely occupied city. In such areas, the possibility of buried or submerged archaeological remains becomes increasingly relevant as researchers attempt to reconstruct the ancient layout of the region. Even without direct evidence, repetition across independent studies has given these locations a persistent importance, suggesting that their relevance is not incidental, but rooted in broader spatial patterns. Across long periods of natural change, the Euphrates has shifted course in ways that reshaped entire sections of the surrounding landscape. These gradual movements, driven by flooding cycles, sediment buildup, and erosion, have altered the boundaries of ancient settlements and redefined the terrain that once surrounded them. In some cases, features that were once part of dry land may now lie beneath river channels or waterlogged soil, making their original position difficult to determine. Historical river migration in Mesopotamia is known to have occurred multiple times, meaning that entire archaeological zones may have been displaced vertically or horizontally over centuries of natural transformation. The cumulative effect of these shifts is a landscape in which original reference points are no longer fixed, complicating attempts to align past and present geography. Under layers formed by repeated flooding and sediment deposition, earlier ground levels have become increasingly difficult to distinguish. The accumulation of alluvial material over centuries can conceal architectural remains, burial contexts, and structural foundations beneath dense deposits that obscure direct observation. In regions where the river has changed course multiple times, distinguishing between natural layering and human construction becomes a complex process, requiring careful analysis of both geological and archaeological indicators. In some cases, what appears to be a uniform landscape from above may contain multiple hidden phases of occupation stacked beneath one another, each representing a different period in the region's long history. These buried sequences create a vertical record that remains largely inaccessible without extensive intervention. Early investigations into these river-adjacent zones were often constrained by unstable terrain and limited excavation capability. Soft soil conditions, seasonal flooding, and shifting water tables made sustained archaeological work difficult in certain areas. As a result, some regions received only preliminary attention before being set aside in favour of more accessible sites. These early limitations meant that potentially significant areas may have been recorded without being fully explored, leaving open questions about what may still remain beneath the surface. Field notes from earlier expeditions often acknowledge these constraints, describing locations that were identified but not examined in depth due to the risks involved. In certain sections of the Euphrates basin, environmental conditions have prevented sustained or precise archaeological access. Water saturation, erosion risk, and sediment instability create challenges that affect both the safety and accuracy of excavation efforts. Even when potential sites are identified, the conditions above them can make direct investigation impractical without significant engineering intervention. In some cases, the depth of sediment alone is enough to deter further exploration, as removing it could destabilize surrounding layers and permanently alter the site's integrity. The balance between access and preservation becomes particularly difficult in environments where the ground itself cannot support prolonged excavation. Preservation concerns linked to submerged or partially submerged terrain have influenced the decision to restrict deeper excavation attempts. Archaeologists often must balance the desire to investigate with the risk of damaging fragile or unknown structures beneath the surface. In river-adjacent environments, excavation can alter water flow or destabilize surrounding layers, potentially affecting both the site and the broader ecosystem. This cautious approach has become especially important in regions where archaeological value is suspected but not yet confirmed, creating a situation where absence of action is sometimes a form of preservation. Protecting what lies beneath may require leaving it undisturbed until conditions allow for safer and more controlled investigation. Despite such limitations, patterns identified through combined geological and archaeological surveys continue to suggest the presence of buried structures. Remote sensing, sediment analysis, and comparative mapping have revealed anomalies in certain zones that align with expectations of ancient human activity. Subsurface variations in density and composition can indicate the presence of foundations or voids beneath the sediment, though these signals remain indirect. While these indicators do not confirm specific identities or functions, they contribute to a growing sense that significant material may lie beneath areas that have not yet been fully excavated. The difficulty lies in separating meaningful signals from natural irregularities produced by centuries of environmental change. When multiple datasets are aligned, a more defined zone of potential interest begins to emerge along the river's historical corridor. This process does not produce a single pinpoint location, but rather a narrowed field in which several indicators overlap. Historical records, environmental data, and archaeological observations converge to suggest that certain areas warrant closer attention. However, without direct access to the subsurface layers, these conclusions remain provisional, dependent on indirect evidence rather than confirmed discovery. Each layer of interpretation adds clarity in some respects while introducing new uncertainty in others, reinforcing the complexity of the investigation. Even with refined mapping techniques, direct examination of the suspected location remains obstructed by persistent environmental barriers. The combination of water coverage, sediment depth, and terrain instability continues to limit the possibility of full excavation. As a result, the investigation exists in a state of partial visibility, where the outlines of interest can be traced but not fully entered or verified. This creates a situation where knowledge advances through approximation rather than confirmation, with each improvement in technique still falling short of physical access. The location becomes increasingly defined in theory, even as it remains physically unreachable. The location of what may be the burial site of Gilgamesh beneath the shifting course of the Euphrates can be traced, but the ground above it has never been fully opened. What was claimed to be found inside the tomb of Gilgamesh? Discussions surrounding Gilgamesh-related archaeology sometimes move away from physical sites and toward accounts that developed alongside earlier investigative efforts. As interest in Mesopotamian history expanded through both academic publications and public reinterpretations, attention gradually shifted toward descriptions that were never tied to a single verified excavation. These accounts often appear in reference to earlier fieldwork in southern Iraq, where the figure of Gilgamesh remained central in historical and literary analysis, yet no confirmed burial context has ever been formally established. In many cases, the discussion itself becomes layered, with later interpretations repeatedly referencing earlier interpretations rather than returning to original archaeological documentation. The result is a body of material that exists more as a chain of references than as a record grounded in primary evidence. Fragmented references emerging from earlier interpretations began to circulate descriptions attempting to outline what might have been associated with a supposed burial context. In some versions, these descriptions were presented as indirect summaries of findings, while in others they appeared as speculative reconstructions based on the cultural importance of Uruk and its royal tradition. The lack of a unified source meant that each retelling introduced subtle differences, gradually separating the narrative from any identifiable archaeological origin. Over time, what was originally uncertain became increasingly variable, shaped more by repetition than by evidence, with each new retelling adding interpretive detail that was not present in earlier accounts. The process resembles a gradual accumulation, where uncertainty is not resolved but redistributed across multiple versions. These varying accounts present details attributed to the same supposed discovery in shifting forms, often shaped more by reinterpretation than by direct observation. Some narratives suggest the presence of royal insignia or ceremonial objects, while others refer more generally to items associated with early kingship in Mesopotamia. In certain retellings, references are made to constructed chambers or enclosed spaces, described in ways that imply deliberate design without specifying measurable dimensions or identifiable materials. However, none of these descriptions are anchored to a documented excavation report that can be independently verified. In professional archaeological practice, such absence of primary context is significant, since interpretation relies heavily on stratigraphy, provenance, and controlled recording, all of which are missing from the claims in question. The absence of a consistent material record means that the details exist primarily within secondary discussions rather than within established archaeological findings. No established archaeological record documents any verified excavation of a tomb attributed to Gilgamesh, even though later commentary continues to reference it. Excavations conducted in and around Uruk have uncovered extensive evidence of early urban development, including temples, administrative structures, and domestic areas, but none have been directly linked to a specific royal burial matching the figure described in literary tradition. The archaeological layers of the site reveal long-term occupation and rebuilding phases, yet within these layers no burial context has been isolated that corresponds to the narrative of Gilgamesh as a historical king. This absence is not the result of incomplete reporting alone, but reflects a consistent pattern across decades of documented research. The gap between narrative association and material confirmation remains a defining feature of the subject, shaping how both scholars and observers approach the topic. Interest in Mesopotamian antiquity expanding beyond academic circles allowed speculative narratives surrounding Gilgamesh to enter broader historical discussion. As translations of ancient texts became more widely available, the figure of Gilgamesh gained renewed attention, not only as a subject of literary study, but also as a potential historical figure. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself, preserved in fragmented cuneiform tablets, contributed to this renewed visibility as readers encountered a narrative that blended heroic tradition with early reflections on kingship, mortality, and civilization. This wider visibility contributed to a blending of interpretive layers where literary tradition, archaeological inquiry, and public imagination began to overlap in ways that were not always clearly separated. In this overlap, the distinction between documented evidence and inferred possibility became increasingly difficult to maintain. Academic evaluations of these claims have repeatedly pointed to the absence of primary excavation data supporting their validity. Researchers working in Mesopotamian archaeology consistently emphasize the importance of stratified context, where artifacts must be traceable to specific layers and locations within a controlled excavation environment. Without such context, claims of discovery cannot be verified, regardless of how frequently they appear in secondary sources. This methodological standard has remained central to distinguishing between hypothesis and confirmed archaeological evidence, particularly in regions where later disturbances and environmental changes have further complicated site interpretation. In this framework, repetition does not strengthen a claim unless it is supported by independently verifiable data. Material evidence from verified Mesopotamian burials shows no structural or contextual alignment with the descriptions found in these reports. Known burial practices in the region vary across time periods and social context, but they are consistently documented through physical remains, spatial organization, and associated artifacts. When compared to these established patterns, the reported claims lack the necessary archaeological markers that would allow for identification or classification within known burial traditions. Even in elite contexts, where burial goods and spatial arrangements are more elaborate, there remains a clear distinction between confirmed finds and narrative-based descriptions that cannot be traced to excavation data. This contrast reinforces the separation between what has been physically uncovered and what has been described without direct evidence. The persistence of these narratives appears closely tied to the cultural weight of Gilgamesh within early Mesopotamian literary tradition. As one of the most enduring figures in ancient storytelling, Gilgamesh occupies a unique position between myth and history, making him a frequent subject of interpretive expansion. This cultural significance has contributed to the continued interest in locating a physical counterpart to the literary king, even in the absence of direct archaeological evidence. The strength of the narrative itself often sustains attention beyond what the material record can currently support, allowing the story to evolve independently of excavation outcomes. In this way, the figure continues to generate new interpretations even when no new physical data is introduced. Over time, variations of the same alleged description continue to circulate independently, never consolidating into a single verifiable account. Each iteration reflects a different layer of interpretation, shaped by context, translation, or secondary reporting. In some instances, later versions simplify earlier descriptions, while others expand them with additional detail, creating a widening gap between versions rather than convergence. As these versions diverge, they illustrate how easily archaeological curiosity can evolve into fragmented narrative forms when not anchored to a consistent source. The result is a collection of descriptions that resemble each other in theme but differ in detail and origin, reinforcing ambiguity rather than resolving it. Without consistent archaeological grounding, the reported claims remain separate from the material record they are often associated with. In practice, this means that while the idea of a tomb linked to Gilgamesh continues to appear in discussion, it does so without corresponding physical evidence from any confirmed excavation site. The distinction between narrative association and archaeological verification remains clear within professional analysis, even if it becomes less defined in broader cultural interpretation. The continued presence of these claims reflects not a confirmed discovery, but an enduring gap between what is described and what has been found. The discovery exists in records and retellings, never in anything that has been directly uncovered. The silence. After the Gilgamesh discovery. Following earlier attention directed toward Gilgamesh-related investigations, expectations of continued archaeological reporting briefly emerged before gradually fading from recorded records. In the period immediately after renewed interest in the subject, there was a brief sense that additional material might be published, or that earlier interpretations would be expanded through further fieldwork. That expectation, however, existed more in anticipation than in documented continuation, as no sustained chain of updates ever fully developed from the earlier phase of attention. In many archaeological contexts, this early phase is usually where clarity begins to increase, but in this case it instead marked the beginning of a long period without visible progression. The momentum that often follows initial attention did not translate into a sustained investigative trajectory. Shortly after initial public and academic interest reached its peak, anticipation developed around the possibility of additional findings or expanded excavation updates. This expectation was shaped by how archaeological discoveries typically progress, where preliminary reports are usually followed by more detailed analyses, revised interpretations, or new excavation results. In this case, however, the anticipated sequence did not unfold in the usual manner, leaving an early gap between attention and continuation that became increasingly noticeable over time. Even informal academic references began to reflect this pause, noting interest without accompanying evidence of continued field activity. What initially appeared to be the beginning of a longer process instead settled into a static point. Subsequent documentation, however, shows a noticeable decline in any new material being added to accounts surrounding the supposed site. References that once appeared with relative frequency in broader archaeological summaries began to appear less often, and when they did, they offered no additional detail beyond earlier descriptions. The absence of new data meant that existing interpretations were left unchanged, with no further clarification or expansion emerging from later stages of inquiry. In fields where incremental revision is standard practice, this lack of development is itself a meaningful signal. It suggests not only a pause in investigation, but a possible shift in focus away from the subject entirely. Formal archaeological communication later reflected an absence of continuing field reports connected to the earlier phase of attention. In standard excavation practice, even uncertain or inconclusive sites tend to generate periodic updates, whether through preliminary findings, environmental assessments, or methodological reviews. The lack of such reporting in this case marked a noticeable deviation from typical field documentation patterns, especially in a region where ongoing research activity is otherwise well established. Over time, this deviation became more apparent as comparable projects in nearby areas continued to produce structured updates. The contrast highlights the unusual nature of the silence that followed. In archaeological practice, active sites typically generate successive layers of publication, making extended silence a notable deviation from standard reporting patterns. Each phase of excavation is usually accompanied by incremental dissemination of information, allowing findings to be reviewed, challenged, or refined over time. When that sequence is interrupted or does not begin at all, it creates a gap that is often as significant as the absence of physical evidence itself, since it interrupts the expected rhythm of scientific communication. This rhythm is one of the key ways archaeological knowledge builds credibility and continuity, and when it's absent, interpretation becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Comparable excavation projects in Mesopotamia have historically produced incremental updates, even when results remain inconclusive or uncertain. Sites across the region frequently undergo multiple stages of interpretation, where initial surveys are followed by deeper excavation campaigns or reanalysis of earlier data. This iterative process allows archaeological understanding to evolve gradually, even in the absence of definitive discoveries. Against that backdrop, the lack of continued reporting in this case stands out as an unusual interruption in a normally continuous process. It also raises questions about whether investigation paused, concluded, or simply shifted away from public documentation without formal acknowledgement. Isolated references to the earlier subject occasionally appear in broader summaries, yet they introduce no new evidence or development. These mentions tend to restate earlier interpretations or briefly acknowledge prior interest without adding additional archaeological context. As a result, they function more as residual references than as active contributions to ongoing research, maintaining the presence of the topic without advancing its understanding. In some cases, these references appear years apart, further emphasizing the lack of continuity. The subject persists in memory, but not in measurable progress. The narrative surrounding the subject gradually became detached from any active investigative framework. What once existed as a point of archaeological curiosity ceased to be part of an evolving field process, leaving it outside the cycle of observation, reporting, and revision that defines ongoing excavation work. This detachment did not occur abruptly, but through the gradual absence of new engagement with the subject within formal archaeological channels. Over time, it became less a subject of investigation and more a reference point within historical summaries. The transition reflects a shift from inquiry to recollection. Scattered public references continued to surface, though they no longer aligned with ongoing archaeological discourse. These references often appeared in contexts removed from fieldwork itself, sometimes drawing on earlier material without integrating new findings or verified updates. Over time, the separation between public mention and academic investigation became more pronounced, reinforcing the sense that the subject was no longer part of active study. What remained in circulation was interpretation without reinforcement from new evidence, sustained by earlier momentum rather than current discovery. The record no longer shows any progression beyond the point where earlier interest came to an end. No subsequent documentation, excavation update, or formal reassessment has been recorded to extend the initial phase of attention into a continued line of inquiry. Within the structured nature of archaeological reporting, this absence of progression effectively marks a stopping point in the documented history of the subject. In practical terms, it represents a conclusion defined not by closure, but by lack of continuation. The silence itself becomes part of the record, shaping how the entire sequence is understood. What began as an anticipated line of investigation concluded without any documented resolution or confirmed follow-up.